Hello and welcome to another episode of The Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark Seven, and as always I'm glad to have you back here with me again for another discussion of military history. Today we're going to start with a new topic, one related to some of our previous episodes dealing with various aspects of the Spanish Civil War. This time we'll be looking at the origins of the Spanish Foreign Legion, or the Tercio de Extranjeros. In particular, we'll be examining the evolution of this crack unit during the long and persistent conflict between the Spanish colonial authorities and the indigenous resistance and insurrectionist forces in the Protectorate of Morocco. This conflict raged throughout the first decades of the 20th century, and the activity of the Legion here was instrumental in the eventual Spanish triumph. The hard and sustained fighting that took place here, for which the Tercio had been specifically created, shaped the outlook and careers of a young and ambitious group of Spanish officers, who were to become the leaders of the forces that would eventually fight the Civil War during the next decade. For this episode, I'll be drawing primarily from The Betrothed of Death by Jose E. Alvarez, an exhaustive survey of the Legion's participation in the campaigns in Morocco between 1920 and 27. I'll also be using some information from Primo de Rivera and Abdel Krim, a PhD thesis prepared by Shannon E. Fleming, and the book Rebels in the Rif by David S. Woolman. So with that said, let's go to North Africa at the turn of the 20th century, where competing European imperialisms in the region were leading to a permanent settlement. The competing claims of France and Spain were settled by the Franco-Spanish Treaty of Fez in November 1912. This recognized Spanish jurisdiction over a territory running along the Mediterranean coast from the Atlantic to the Melilla River, not far from the frontier of Algeria, extending inland to a line roughly 25 miles north of the River Verga in the south. This resulted in a rough rectangle of land about 225 miles long west to east and 30 to 50 miles north to south. This is about the size of the American state of Massachusetts. At the time, this constituted the largest piece of overseas territory held by Spain, who had, with a few insignificant exceptions, lost the entirety of their colonial empire in the latter half of the last years of the 19th century. There are few cities of any size in this territory. Most of those are in the western portion of the country. The most important of these are Ceuta, on a small peninsula on the northernmost coast facing Spain across the Straits of Gibraltar, Tetuan, the capital of the Spanish territories in Africa, located to the south of Ceuta, and Larache on the Atlantic coast. In the east, the only town of any size was the important one of Melilla, situated on a small coastal plain and surrounded by mountains to the south. Numerous villages and somewhat larger settlements dot the landscape, generally in the vicinity of the few small rivers, and scattered at long intervals elsewhere. Most of the country consists of arid or semi-arid highlands, interspersed here and there with small plains. The plains of the region that do not occur along the coast consist of arid, desert-like terrain, at least during the hot, dry months of the summer. The country resembles in places the American Rockies, with peaks rising frequently above 5,000 feet or more than 1,500 meters. The mountains rise abruptly out of the Mediterranean for the most part, and systems of peaks and valleys extend inland to the south, generally decreasing in height. The highest peak, Mount Titaguin, rises to 7,600 feet or about 2,200 meters, and its peak is covered with snow for almost half the year. Forests occur in patches and portions of the Spanish zone, and the region known as the Gamara stands of tall and magnificent cedars can be found. Much of the highlands of Morocco are rocky and bald, however. The valleys of the country are carefully and densely cultivated, and the prevailing aridity during the growing season requires great skill of Moroccan farmers to bring a decent harvest from the reluctant earth. As a result, ingenious schemes of irrigation and intensive cultivation, similar to the systems of intensive farming and horticulture practiced in the semi-arid regions of Spain, are found in the country. Indeed, these Spanish forms of food production on arid ground were descended from North African farming techniques imported into the peninsula by the Moors centuries before. This hot and dry weather is seasonal, however, and the winter months often bring cold temperatures and heavy rains, which rush down from the highlands and transform the small rivers and streams into torrents. When the 1912 treaty was signed, Spanish presence in this area was minimal. It was almost entirely limited to Larache and the old presidios of Ceuta and Melilla. These latter two enclaves had been Spanish possessions for centuries, from 1578 in the case of the latter, and as long ago as 1497 in the case of Melilla. No roads linked these towns, however, only narrow and perilous tracks suitable only for herders, their goats, and some pack animals. Spanish communications between their coastal enclaves was conducted by sea. Few Spaniards lived in these towns, and hardly any in the hinterland. The mass of the country outside the Presidios was almost entirely a mystery to the Spanish. The Spanish protectorate was bordered on the south and west by the much larger French territories, and in the northwest corner by the international settlement at Tangier, which was formally subject to the suzerainty of the Moroccan Sultan, but in reality a battleground of competing European interests, primarily those of the French and British. The Protectorate and the Rif are often spoken of in European language sources as if they were identical, but this is not the case. Spanish territory was naturally divided into a number of geographical regions, of which the Rif, consisting of a small coastal plain and mountains near the center of the territory, are only one. There are also the Jabala, a relatively fertile and settled district in the heart of the western portion of the territory, and the Kert to the east of the Rif, including the river of the same name. From the Kert to the eastern border of the territory was the region of the Gomara, including the city of Melilla. Finally, least important for the campaigns of this conflict, must include the Lucus, which included the Rash on the Atlantic coast south of Tangier, and the country inland towards the Jabala. Among these mountains, deserts, and valleys lived approximately 760,000 inhabitants. These people were Berbers, which in the anthropology of my sources indicates people of Caucasian ethnicity who spoke a language of the Hamido-Semitic family. These were organized into a tribal social structure, in which the tribe was a grouping of clans, which were themselves groupings of subclans, which were in turn made up of individual families. Tribal names generally begin with the word Beni, Ulad, or Aith, which denotes sons of or people of, followed by a place name or that of a common male ancestor. Thus, the name of one such tribe, the Beni Saman, translates to the sons of Selman. Similarly, the name of another tribe, the Eighth Waryagar, denotes a place instead and means the people of Waryagar. In very general terms, the Berber cultural substrate had been subject to Arabization in varying degrees, with the greatest degree of Arabic cultural influence in the far west of the Lucus, while the Rif, and in particular the Beni Urigel tribe, largest and most powerful, was considered to absorb the least amount of Arabic influence and most closely preserve the original Berber ways of life. Each tribe controlled a territory, and were all in theory subject to the Sultan of Morocco, who in fact held little real power over the leaders of the tribes. This limited influence became more and more tenuous as one travels eastwards. In practical terms, the tribes were controlled by leaders known as Imgaran, which translates to counselors. These were local strongmen of one kind or another, often with an element of Islamic religious authority as part of their influence. In the absence of a strong central authority, order was maintained by a system of alliances between the tribes. An identical system of alliance and balance of power arrangements was maintained at all levels of the tribal system, that is, between the families, clans, subclans, etc., in order to keep peace within the individual tribe. This system of alliances, known as the Lif, is worth explaining, both due to its importance in maintaining the balance of power in the country and because of the light it shines on the motivations and psychologies of the leaders of the inhabitants of Spanish Morocco. If, in the course of one of the many feuds and vendettas, one party would find itself very hard-pressed and in serious danger, they could send their best bull to the mosque of one of the neighboring tribes and slaughter it there in sacrifice. The neighboring tribe, like it or not, was socially obliged to go to the supplicant tribe's aid. This was because the bull often represented the most valuable possession of the supplicant tribe. To refuse aid to the tribe who had given yours its most valuable possession would be unthinkable. This may seem an implausible mechanism to modern sensibilities, but whatever the mechanism was, the bull sacrifice resulted in an effective alliance more often than not, and could be taken for granted. This meant that actually eliminating a rival tribe, by extermination or conquest, was very difficult. Coupled with the very egalitarian culture of the Moroccan highlanders, the Lif system ensured a decentralization of power and wealth, and acted to limit the influence of a strong leader. While this would greatly hinder any effective sense of national unity and cooperation for larger international purposes, it nonetheless acted to unify the tribes against the encroachments of outside powers. Fighting in small-scale warfare, as in many similarly structured societies, was endemic to the Moroccan countryside. The typical family dwelling in this area included a stronghold or bunker-type building with thick, loopholed walls, into which the inhabitants could retreat in case of an assault by rivals or enemies. These feuds and raids were partly motivated by simple survival pressure, because though a great variety of produce and meat was produced in the country, it was often insufficient for the needs of the people. In addition, the absence of a strong police authority in the country meant that ordinary crimes would of necessity be punished by means of vengeance or retribution exacted by the victim or his relatives. As a result of this comparative physical danger of their lives, the average male inhabitant of Spanish Morocco was familiar with arms, and very likely had some kind of combat experience. In some places it was considered inappropriate for a man who had not yet killed an enemy in one of the many feuds to marry. Some sources describe celebrations held for young men by their families after their first kill, and it seems that it was at least not uncommon for this to be considered a normal rite of passage on the way to full manhood. When mobilized for war, they would assemble into small, highly mobile fighting units known as harkas. Nearly always they fought as foot soldiers, as horses were quite rare among these poor highlanders. This should not be taken to give an impression of the Moroccans as an exclusively violent and hot-headed people. Though much more warlike in their daily lives and manners than contemporary Europeans, they of course reacted to their environment in a number of ways, and were fully capable of functioning under the contemporary forms of law and order. A large number of tribesmen often migrated temporarily to the larger towns of the Spanish and French zones to seek paid labor to compensate for the low productivity of their tribal lands. As we shall see later on, some of the prominent figures in the resistance to Spanish rule were educated men who were equally at home in the urbane and sophisticated world of the European upper classes on the other side of the Mediterranean. It should not be assumed that the population was by any means uniform in attitude or temperament either. Take, for example, the regions most important to the story of the military campaigns in the Protectorate, the Jabala in the west and the Rif and Gamara in the east. Those in the west thought of themselves as more cosmopolitan than their eastern cousins. After all, the majority of the large towns were located in their area. The men of the eastern regions, whose livelihood was often less settled, were the more warlike of the two, and often looked down on the Jabalis, who would have seemed soft to them. The differences between the regions went beyond outlook and attitude. Violence was less common in the Jabala, and the Lif alliance, while still common, was not as prominent a feature of life there. Nevertheless, it is the case that all the Berber inhabitants of the Spanish zone were raised in a social world where warlike qualities of stoicism, endurance, self-reliance, fierce in-group loyalty, and ruthlessness to enemies were imbibed with their mother's milk. As an English writer expressed himself in the Tangier Gazette, writing in 1905, quote, "There is not a man from the Rift to the Atlas but believes that he and his brethren, armed with rusting Remingtons and 100 rounds of cartridges apiece, are more than a match for any force in the world that could be sent against them." Such a population would pose a serious challenge to any colonial administration. So now let's take a look at how the Spanish set out to rule them. For the first 3 centuries or so, their Moroccan presidios cost the Spanish little trouble. Very little considered opposition to their presence on the coast was mounted by the inhabitants. Clashes between Spaniards and Moroccans began to escalate in the latter half of the 19th century. There were a number of reasons for this. The presence and influence of European imperialists from France, Britain, and Germany, as well as Spain, had stirred up a good deal of resentment and opposition among the tribes. Also, glorious military adventures abroad had an appeal to Spanish leaders of the time, both to compensate somewhat for the progressive loss of the Pacific and Latin American colonies, and also as a distraction from the terrible domestic difficulties that saddled the country at the time. The first major clash with the Spaniards came in 1859, with the men of the Angera tribe, whose territory adjoined the Presidio of Ceuta. Here, the Spanish had begun construction of fortifications on the outskirts of the city. This met with Angera disapproval. Some of their number mounted a raid on the unfinished works, killing several Spaniards, pulling down the fortifications, and disfiguring a Spanish coat of arms at the site. Incensed, the Spanish governor demanded restitution, only to be met with dilatory time-wasting tactics on the part of the Sultan. This frustrating process came to an end later that year when the Sultan, Abderrahman, died. Still having received no satisfaction, the Spanish declared war on the Moroccans. The Spanish army under the command of General Leopoldo O'Donnell marched south from Ceuta for Tetuan on New Year's Day 1860. The Moroccans fiercely opposed this move, but were unable to stop the Spanish from taking Tetuan in the first week of February. Both sides had suffered heavily in the numerous skirmishes attending the advance. The Spanish came out on top of it in all these struggles, but took a beating. Once Tetuan was taken, the Spanish began to push westwards into the area between it and Tangier. Meanwhile, their fleet bombarded Tangier, Larache, and Asila. The campaign ended in the first days of March, when the Moroccans sued for peace. Both sides had paid a heavy toll in the fighting. Spanish casualties estimated 1,000 killed and more than 3,000 wounded. The cost of the Moroccans is unknown. The Spanish seemed to be unsure what to do with the territory they had occupied. It remained at Tetuan until a war indemnity of 20 million pesetas had been paid by the Sultan. This did not cover the cost of the war. Further minor campaigns of this sort would take place throughout the rest of the 19th century. Spain gained little from these clashes, as she had no real colonial policy in regard to Morocco. The great majority of the Spanish public was apathetic or opposed to colonial acquisition. The conscription necessary to pursue any such program was a major irritant. The major support for colonization in Morocco came from a small minority of nationalists who saw in the unexploited land across the straits the salvation of the Spanish state and economy, which had fallen distinctly behind the standard of progress being achieved by the other nations of Western Europe. Most prominent among these supporters were the radical elements of the army, who were becoming known as the Africanistas. These men included the most vocal, ambitious, and politically active members of the army. For them, subjugation of the Moroccan territory meant a redemption of the national honor and military glory of Spain, distinctly tarnished by the poor record of Spanish arms in the 19th century, which was capped by the disastrous Spanish-American War. More selfish careerist concerns intruded as well, as the territory offered the only field for ambitious officers to achieve notable feats of arms and merit rapid promotion. Without such opportunity, the Spanish officer, however competent, was doomed to long periods of career stagnation, waiting for the slow process of promotion on the basis of seniority to work its way down to him through the rest of the very bloated officer corps. This promotions issue, which divided the army roughly between those who were content with a slow career in one of the mainland garrisons, and the more aggressive and often more able officers who sought rapid promotion on the battlefield, would generate a major political split in the army. In 1904, the situation became somewhat more resolved as a result of an agreement with France, which was rapidly expanding and consolidating its supremacy in West Africa. This agreement recognized the Spanish sphere of influence in the area of her historic presidios, and the two powers agreed to exercise a protectorate over the domain of the Moroccan Sultan. As with all protectorates, the stated purpose was to defend the legitimate ruler of the country who was too weak to maintain their own power. The larger, great power purpose was to secure the area against the encroachment of the Germans, who were seeking influence there, and as a result, this arrangement was satisfactory not only to the French and Spanish, but also to the British. The Sultan at this time was very weak in the northern and northeastern portions of his realm with which we are concerned. The real powers in the land were a pair of warlords or adventurers who, in their character and careers, illustrate the kind of man who rose to the top of the violent and fragmented world of Spanish Morocco. The first of these exercised his sway over the Jabala region in the west. His name was Moulay Ahmed al-Razuli. This man was the son of a prominent sharif. This title denoted a potentate of a religious nature, and Razuli's father had been powerful enough to be virtually independent of the Sultan in his territory, which was centered on the holy mountain of Jebel Alam in the central Jabala, the territory of the tribe of Beni Aros. He was trained in Islamic law and religion, but soon became bored of it and turned to more adventurous pursuits. He gathered a group of freebooters around himself and soon made a name for himself in the region, combining the characteristics of feudal lord, bandit chieftain, and Robin Hood. He quickly became notorious in the land, earning a not always unfavorable reputation, and the nickname the Eagle of Zinat, after the village in which he was born. His activities earned him the enmity of the Pasha of Tangier, who imprisoned him in horrific conditions for 4 years. Razuli was chained to a rock in a filthy dungeon, weighted down by the neck, hands, and feet so as to be unable to move, often next to the decomposing remains of his erstwhile fellow prisoners. Needless to say, this experience changed him for the worse. When he was released in a general amnesty upon the accession of the new Sultan Abdulaziz, he had become a much more cruel and relentless man. He assembled a new group of henchmen in no time and began a spectacular career of brigandage and kidnapping. His exploits became legendary in the region. To give an example which gives the flavor of his new reputation, he was said to have purchased a man against which he had a grudge from a rival chieftain for a sum equal to about 1,500 contemporary dollars, which was a fortune in the circumstances. solely to have the satisfaction of beheading the man at the door of his own house. He went so far as to maintain a small fleet of ships on the Mediterranean coast to prey on coastal shipping, and his kidnappings brought Raisuli huge sums in ransom. The most prominent became an international incident, sometimes called the Perdicaris affair. A Greek who claimed American citizenship, Ion Pericardus, and his stepson were kidnapped by Raisuli's men from their estate at Tangier and held for ransom. In the U.S., President Theodore Roosevelt, who was loath to let anyone push Americans around anywhere in the world, threatened action against Morocco if the hostages were not returned, sending a cable to his Secretary of State John Hay, which read, "I want Perdicaris alive or Raisuli dead. If the Sultan could not take care of this, then TR would send the U.S. Marines after Raisuli." This put the unhappy Sultan, who had little force to bring to bear against the kidnappers, between a rock and a hard place. Eventually he paid Raisuli off to free the hostages. Exploits such as these lent an aura of great power and invincibility to the Sharif that combined well with his religious authority. He was even thought by some to have actual magic powers, and it was said that he could only be harmed by a golden pistol ball forged in the holy city of Mecca. Raisuli exercised his dominion from the mountain fortress of Tazarut, and his influence extended throughout most of the western zone of Spanish Morocco. His power over the tribes as a combination warlord holy man was considerable, and few in the area would choose lightly to oppose him. Eagle of Janat was canny enough not to make too much trouble with the Spanish, and chose instead to profit by their presence. He was content to make arrangements with them by which, for a fee, he would act on their behalf throughout his domain. These arrangements were not very faithfully kept. Though he would remain a thorn in their side, he caused little major trouble for the Spaniards before the 1920s. A more present danger for the Spaniards in the first years of the century was located in the eastern regions. Here, a pretender to the Sultan's throne, claiming to be the lost son of the dead Sultan Mulay Hassan, had united the tribes of the northeastern portion of Morocco and made himself independent of the Sultan. This man, known as El Rogui or sometimes Bouhamara, became very powerful among the warlike inhabitants of the region. Ironically, the discovery of vast mineral wealth in his domain led to his downfall. Some of the mountains and hills of the Rif and Gamara, where El Rogui held control, were found to contain rich deposits of high-quality iron ore. As a result, he made his mistake. He sold mining rights to these rich districts to European companies. While this netted him a fortune, the fierce people whose land he had so disposed of united against him and defeated his forces in open battle. He was turned over to the Sultan, who had him tortured to death. The downfall of El Rogui in 1909 led directly to the first major clash of the Spaniards and the Riffians. United against the Rogui, and flushed with victory, the Riffians became very dangerous to any Europeans in their lands. This included the Spanish. On the 9th of July 1909, a construction gang working on a railroad line leading into the ore-producing areas near Melilla was attacked. 4 workers and one of the Spanish soldiers guarding them were killed in this clash. It was decided to punish these tribesmen. 2,000 Spanish troops set out from Melilla, and on the 13th met 6,000 Riffians to the south of the city. 10 days later, a second battle was fought. At the outset of the campaign, Spain took a heavy blow when the first Moroccans, led by General Guillermo Pintos Ledesma, ambushed in a gorge known as Barranco de Lobo, or the Wolf's Ravine. Despite heavy losses, the Spanish were able to push the Riffians back away from the town. The losses taken in these first real battles with the Riffian Harkas were sufficient to cause the government to call up reservists. These were drawn from Catalonia, and the selection was handled ineptly, so that men who had good reason to believe themselves no longer liable to service were drafted. Most of them, not had any military training for years, had settled down into civilian occupations and started families. The call-up was extremely unpopular, and touched off a series of civil disturbances in the city of Barcelona and elsewhere. These anti-war demonstrations were brutally suppressed, fighting in the streets of the Spanish cities. This episode has gone down in Spanish history as the Tragic Week. The draftees were taken in the end, and departed from train stations literally crowded with wailing wives and dependents begging the army not to take them. Needless to say, this episode did little to enhance the standing of the army with the people, especially the Catalans, many of whom saw Spanish imperialism as a whole as little more than an outdated Castilian vanity, were extremely unwilling to sacrifice their sons in its service. However, the voice of the powerless classes from which these conscripts came was never very prominent in the decision-making process of the Spanish government of the day. The conscription and reinforcement of the colonial troops in the Melilla area was carried out despite the protests. Thousands of new troops crossed the straits and were able to push the borders of Spanish control forwards, to include an area about 10 kilometers deep, which stretched from Cape Tres Forcas to Mar Chica. As a result of the experience of the early clashes with the Riffians in the first years of the century, the Spanish raised a unit of indigenous soldiers to fight in the colony. The occasion was the Act of Algeciras in 1910, in which the Moroccan Sultan pledged to create a militarized police force to keep order in the countryside. The Sultan proved unable to do this, and in June of the next year the Spanish army raised a force of locally recruited Moroccan soldiers. These would be known as the Regulares, short for Fuerzas Regulares Indigenas, and the first were established in Melilla in 1911. The Regulares were tough and reliable soldiers. Until the advent of the Tercio a decade later, they constituted the real professional cutting edge of the Spanish army in Africa. Recruited from the same social strata that yielded the Moroccan fighters themselves, they shared the typical strength of their opponents. They too had been raised in a culture of feuding and endemic violence, and imbibed the ideas of courage, toughness, and self-sufficiency of the Moroccan warrior ethos. Like their rivals in the tribal Harkas, the Regulares were an infantry force, though a small cavalry component was added to their establishment later. This professional long-service unit also provided an opportunity for action and rapid promotion that attracted a new crop of ambitious officers to its ranks. These men differed from their older counterparts, who were often animated by an unenterprising, careerist mindset and conditioned by repeated Spanish reverses to accept a defeatist outlook. The young officers who served with the soldiers of the Regulares presented a new type of Spanish military man, aggressive, confident, ruthless, and usually fiercely nationalistic. The new corps was the brainchild of an officer who will figure very prominently in this first phase of the Moroccan conflict, Damaso Berenguer. This man would be one of the most important to the development of the Spanish protectorate. Earlier in his career, he had been sent to serve in French North Africa under the brilliant colonial administrator Marshal Hubert Lyautey. Here he learned firsthand the French methods of colonial control in conditions very similar to those in the lands of the Spanish zone. As a result of this, he learned to approach the problem of bringing the Spanish zone under control as a political task rather than a military one. Patient, statesmanlike, and determined, Berenguer brought this perspective to his various tasks in the protectorate. He advocated a gradual incorporation of the territory, working with existing indigenous leaders and institutions as much as practical. In his view, use of military force was to be limited to what was necessary to ensure Spanish control, and was to be avoided if at all possible. The Regulares, small, highly effective striking force, were a key part of this plan. In mid-1911, another occasion arose which further defined the Spanish claim on her zone. At the time, the French military appeared at La Roche and began recruiting for her forces in this area, explicitly rewarded to the Spanish in the 1904 treaty. This kind of encroachment could not go unanswered if Spain's claim was to be taken seriously. The armored cruiser Catalunya, sent to the harbor, escorting the transport ship Almirante Lobo, carrying Spanish troops. These landed and occupied the city on the 8th of June. The French proved unwilling to press the matter further and withdrew shortly after. This event was vital in the affirmation of Spain's right to the territory, which up till now had been untested. The La Roche incident brings into our story the other of the chief Spanish military figures in the early years of the conflict. This was Lieutenant Colonel Fernandez Silvestre, who commanded the landing force aboard the Almirante Lobo. Silvestre was another larger-than-life figure like Raizuli, a bold and swaggering soldier. It's a very different personality from the methodical and patient Berenguer. Silvestre was a rougher man and a born fighter, and thought that the best way to deal with the Moroccans was with a swift and strong hand. He placed great faith in the power of Spanish cojones, and eschewed some of the spit and polish of the military routine. This would bring him into conflict with Berenguer, under whom he would later serve when the former became High Commissioner of the territory, but by and large the two men complemented one another's abilities, and cooperated well during the latter half of the 1910s. The Spanish were to enjoy a little peace in their colony once the status of the territory was settled with regard to the other European powers. The threats they faced here were two: the warlike tribes of the Rif War, and those under the sway of Raizuli and the Jabala. In late 1912, a minor cleric and warlord by the name of El Mizian brought some of the tribes in the area of Melilla under his leadership and moved against the Spanish. They ambushed a cartographic unit of the Spanish army in the nearby countryside, and this attack began a campaign that would last until the spring of the next year. In these battles, the Regulares fought their first major actions. Eventually, Almizian's men were driven out of the Melilla region, beyond the River Kurt, and their leader captured and executed. The Spanish would have their first major clash with the Eagles Janat in 1913, and it is with this campaign that I consider the Rif War proper to begin. The occasion of the war was the Spanish march on the town of Chauen, an important point 40 miles or 65 kilometers southwest of Tetuan. Razouli's men fought the Spanish to a standstill and compelled a retreat into Tetuan. An armistice was reached with the Moroccans. Not long after, however, troops led by Silvestre and General Felipe Alfao, the first High Commissioner of the Protectorate, advanced back into the Jabala. Numerous small actions were fought between the Spaniards and Razouli's men, who proved to be dangerous adversaries. Eventually, the campaign petered out and an agreement was reached with Razouli. The campaigns between 1909 and 1913 starkly revealed, not only to the Spanish public but to the Spanish military leadership, the deplorable state to which the Spanish army had fallen. Corruption, incompetence, and factionalism marked the officer corps. The draftee soldiers, who were the huge majority of the serving troops, were apathetic, mistreated, badly trained, and very often illiterate. Equipment and supplies were siphoned off and sold by corrupt officers, and the money for replacements and upkeep was stolen. In combat with the tough fighters of the Moroccan highlands, they performed very poorly, and even minor campaigns such as the one against Chauen, which had very, very modest goals, were difficult to accomplish. The exception to this uninspiring picture were the Regulares. At first, the Moroccan soldiers were met with mistrust on the part of the Spaniards, but they quickly proved themselves in the heavy fighting near Melilla against Almizian. They would soon become the spearhead of the Spanish effort in the colony. The officers of the Regulares followed the French practice of command at the front of their men. They fought hard and suffered the highest casualty rates of the army, and were soon regarded, accurately, as an elite force. Throughout these campaigns, the Regulares would fight the heaviest battles, while the conscript units would be used mainly to man fortifications and to garrison the cities. By the end of the decade, 4 battalion-sized units of Regulares, called tabors, would be on strength. After this time, they would be joined in the vanguard of the Spanish effort by the Legion. The years immediately after 1913 saw a little substantial change in the Spanish position. Relations with Razouli and the Jabala continued to be variable, but more or less stable, and clashes between his forces and the Spanish remained relatively infrequent and did not threaten Spanish control over the region about Ceuta, Tetuan, and Tangier. Gradually, the Spanish consolidated their position in the west and improved road and rail links between their towns there. Though not spectacular, Spanish moves here had secured their control of the region and had begun to win the respect of the tribes in the vicinity. Much of this was due to the wise policy of Berenguer, who had become High Commissioner in 1918. His moderate approach to the pacification of the region limited the use of force to such essential tasks as keeping order in the lands under Spanish control and protecting her land communications. The crowning success of Berenguer's policy in the west came in 1920 with the almost bloodless occupation of the key town of Chauen, and the object of the failed 1913 campaign. With the occupation of this town, the goal of the High Commissioner's strategy in the west were by and large achieved. It appeared that the Spanish had recovered from their initial difficulties in the Protectorate and had brought the territory under control. While Berenguer was operating against Razouli's men in the west, a parallel effort was being mounted in the east, emanating from Melilla. Here Silvestre, now a general, was in charge, and had an army of 25,700 men at his disposal. With these men he was pushing into the Rif, and establishing a series of fortified outposts to control the area. The ultimate objective of this movement was Alhucemas Bay, in the heart of the Rif. They were opposed by a resistant movement among the tribes of the region led by a pair of brothers, Mohammed and Mohammed el-Belkrim. These were sons of a prominent leader of the Beni Iraguel tribe, and would prove to be Spain's most dangerous antagonists in the colony. We'll look more closely at these brothers, who would lead the most successful struggle against the Spanish in the next episode. For now, it is sufficient to know that they sought to free their land from foreign domination, and had now achieved the degree of support necessary to embark on this plan, including a force of seasoned Harkas. Their first objective was the destruction of Silvestre's force, now intruding into the territories under their control. Silvestre, against Berenguer's advice, had crossed the river Amercan and established a post at Monte Ibarra in late May 1921. The general was impatient with the strategy of gradual occupation ordered by the High Commissioner, and was looking for an opportunity to win a great victory over the troublesome tribes and bring the resistance in the region to an end once and for all. The advanced post at Ibarra was attacked by a force of 1,000 Riffians, who were joined by a unit of turncoat regulares, who happened to have been recruited from Abdelkrim's Beni Uruguel tribe. The Spanish and the loyal regulares were driven out of the post with 200 casualties. A large number of small arms with ammunition and a battery of artillery were captured by the Riffians in this action. The next Riffian attack came on the near side of the Amercan, at Agueraben, on the 16th of July. Silvestre was at Melilla at the time, and gathered the forces he had available there and marched to the Spanish base at Anual, just to the northeast of the embattled post. Here he took charge of the relief operation, sent the Spanish against the Riffian besiegers, personally leading 2 cavalry charges against their lines. His troops mounted 2 major efforts to break the investment of the outpost over the next 3 days, but all their attacks failed, and his men were driven off by Riffian machine gun and artillery fire. Failure of the relief effort sealed the doom of Agueraben, which fell not long after. The position stood on high ground which overlooked the base at Anual, to which the Spanish had retreated. They were promptly besieged there themselves by the victorious Riffians. Once in Anual, the Spanish began to run low on supplies. Despite repeated calls by radio for reinforcement and rescue, no Spanish forces were available to break the siege. Silvestre, with 4,000 men, was cooped up by Abdelkrim's Harkas, which were also 4,000 strong. As the position became more dire, a council of senior officers was held to determine their course of action. They voted for withdrawal back to the coast, though this would mean the abandonment of their entire position in the Rif. On the morning of the 22nd of July, Silvestre gave the order to withdraw towards Bienteb, and from there back to Monte Arut, most of the way back to Melilla. As the Spaniards moved out, they were harassed by snipers and attacked by partiers of Riffians on their flanks. What began as an orderly retreat degenerated into a panic-stricken rout. Irrational fear and terror took hold of the troops, who broke and fled in total disorder. The Riffians, likely not believing their good fortune, set upon them and hunted them down like rabbits. Estimates of the Spanish dead run far into the thousands, with a few hundred more whose lives were spared so that they could be sold for ransom. As the magnitude of the catastrophe broke over him, General Silvestre was reported to have run after the panicking conscripts, firing a sidearm and shouting, "Run, run! The boogeyman is coming!" before shooting himself. The disaster at Anual was the greatest defeat of a European army in an African colonial action in the 20th century. The defeat here would have far-reaching effects for Spain, her army, and indirectly for Europe as a whole for the next 2 decades. Bodies laid unburied at the site for weeks. The Spanish military position in the east of the colony was completely shattered by this massacre. Some of the few troops remaining in the Melilla region were trapped in isolated outposts, which themselves would soon come under siege by the Riffians, whose tremendous victory had rallied large numbers of fighting men to their cause. The rest had abandoned their equipment and were making their way in straggling groups to the hoped-for sanctuary of Melilla, where terrified soldiers and civilians alike cowered behind walls, waited for the Riffian Harkas to appear at the gates. It appeared very likely that even the ancient Presidio would fall, and the Spanish position in North Africa become untenable. Desperately, the call went out for troops to rush to Melilla to save the city from capture and sack. To meet this emergency, the Spaniards were compelled to roll the dice and depend upon a newly created force of fierce, professional colonial soldiers, who had barely been established before the catastrophe at Anual forced them to step into the breach. For the first and most vital time, the call went out to the Tercio, save Melilla. And that, I think, is where I'll end this episode. I hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful. I hope it forms a good background for what's to come. Next time, we'll look at the men who were called upon to try and save the situation for the Spaniards, the newly formed Spanish Foreign Legion. We'll also take a look at Abdelkrim and his brother, the remarkably effective army they built, and the desperate fight to restore the wreck of Spanish ambitions in the region. As always, I hope this week brings you all that you hope from it. Until next week then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.